Welcome to the Inspired Conversations podcast, hosted by me, Andrea Cova-Bernal. As a college counselor, I'm inspired not only by the incredible students I work with, but also by remarkable change makers in higher education, each with powerful stories of their own. Through storytelling and shared narratives, I believe in the power of connection. Join me as we delve into dialogue and share valuable advice for college success. Hello, Audrey. Welcome to the Inspired Conversations podcast. For those folks who are tuning in today, we are talking a little bit about the power of curiosity. We're going to go a little bit later into even activities lists for college and why, all of that matters, especially now in light of the new affirmative action case, in light of, certain changes in higher education and in the applications. We're going to talk about all of that. But before I do, I just want to remind you, we are in a space where we're sharing powerful stories from change makers in all fields of higher education, whether these are admissions officers, whether they're actual professors, or whether they're partner organizations like Curious Cardinals who are helping to uplift the stories of all sorts of students, whether you're first generation, low income, you come from different parts of the world. All of these programs and folks and professionals matter. So thank you for being here, Audrey. How are you today?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so honored to be having this conversation with you, and I'm great. I can't wait to dive in.
Fabulous. Well, thank you. I know here in Southern California, we are undergoing this massive heat surge right now, as I know the rest of the nation is. And so, in light of all of that heat, there's a lot of other heat going on right now in the higher education world. So, I just want to start though, because I think, as I mentioned earlier, storytelling is such a big passion of mine. I feel like there are not many platforms out there that allow us to truly sort of share where we come from and how we got to where we are today. So Audrey, I want to give you a little platform to share that. I know a little bit of your story, but I'm eager to learn more. Can you just share sort of where you come from, a little bit about your background, and then we're going to talk about your education history as well.
Yes. So I grew up in New York City, and I was the third child, which I honestly, I think attribute that value of mentorship, because even just seeing what someone else has done before is so helpful and determining which steps you want to take and paving the way forward. And I was very passionate, especially being in high school with Trump in office, was very passionate about immigration. My parents are the children of Holocaust survivors so there's something in my family that's super just proud to be immigrants and very much celebratory of immigrants. And so in high school, seeing just the horrible rhetoric in the news made me super upset, but also curious to understand where this came from and how our country had gotten to this point. And so I was also a big debater in high school and was president of the debate team. And then I went to Stanford, and my aspiration was to be an immigration lawyer or the next Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I was very passionate about law as a vehicle to enact social change. And at Stanford, I was studying history, and I was also passionate to learn about the history of marginalized communities and the history that I hadn't learned in school. I was very passionate about I learned at Stanford, took my first women's studies courses, and that was very empowering. I did research on the history of sexual assault, comparing the narratives of Black women and white women. And so very much passionate about, as I said, kind of amplifying the stories of marginalized communities and typically neglected voices and stories. And one of the things I did at Stanford was I taught English to members of the janitorial staff, which I loved.
It was amazing. Yeah.
My favorite 2 hours of my week each week. And then I was sent home from Stanford my freshman year due to the pandemic, and I couldn't continue with that. And I had just loved the experience teaching. And I was sent home and reached out to a bunch of families and decided to start tutoring kids. And tutoring those students, observed how disengaged and uninspired they were with what they were learning in school, and how they were absorbing and regurgitating what they were reading in a textbook, but they didn't know why they were learning. So that inspired me to apply what they were learning in school to my own passions in hopes of igniting their imagination for what they could pursue and why. And I saw that that was a really effective way to engage them, to make their learning feel like it had some meaning. One of them asked for math help. I wasn't as passionate about math. So that's where Alec, my eventual co-founder, came to the picture. Alec was an aerospace engineer at Stanford, and he started applying what they were learning in math to how airplanes fly. And fast forward, they began telling all their friends. And before I knew it, kind of this, my 10-year life plan of on track to be a lawyer had kind of shifted course, and it had shifted course, of course, because of the pandemic. But suddenly I found myself in this position building Curious Cardinals, and it began as a passion project. And now over 3 years later, it is my life's work.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much. My brain is rolling because I just have a few follow-up questions, and I can certainly relate to you, right? I think we come from very different backgrounds, but what I love about dialogue and what I love about storytelling is there's always a similarity in there. You know, I think we often focus so much on differences. And even though we have, you know, you grew up in New York, I grew up in New Mexico, we have very different cultural backgrounds. I think we come from very similar experiences, you know. But one thing that you brought up, and this goes back to your college experience, when you were a freshman, you said you were exposed to some of these classes or courses that perhaps, I know for me, I wouldn't have never taken a women's history course, women's studies course in college. And I think it's a true beauty of a liberal arts college per se. I think both of us have the experience of attending a liberal arts college. But all colleges really have the ability for us to explore, right? There's really no one who says you have to go in and only take math classes and only take classes in history, which was what your trajectory was. But it sounds like you were taking other classes that influenced you. Is there a professor or a class that was like that spark for you that changed things?
100%. So as I said, very much my experience in high school was like, how did we get here? And I was reading a lot. And what I realized when reading books, whether it was about immigration in our country or even our criminal justice system, or lack of justice, was there were so many of these big stats and numbers, but the stats kind of blur the individuality of the experience. And so I crave that kind of storytelling and trying to understand on a more individual human level. And so one of the quotes that really made me, I think, want to pursue history is Marcus Garvey's quote, which is, "A people without its history is like a tree without its roots."
Oh,
And
yes.
which I just think it's so grounding. And so at Stanford, I heard about this professor named Estelle Friedman. I heard she was a very famous professor. She was teaching something called an intro sem, which a lot of universities have freshman or sophomore. You can apply for the courses, and they're kind of smaller size seminars. And so her name preceded her. I didn't even really know what the class was about. I got into the class, and that class was life-changing for me. It was basically learning about history from a women's perspective and learning about women over time. And I remembered my junior year when I learned about the Stanton sisters and like the Seneca Falls Convention. Maybe it had like one line in the textbook. I got so excited. I was like, this is so cool. And I remember after the class, some like boys were making fun of me, like Audrey the feminist, which is so high school. But I remember just getting so excited. And then that was like that class epitomized. It was everything was about the history of women over time. It was called the history of the feminist mystique. And it was so empowering. It was so empowering to have a historical context, understand inequity and misogyny in society, in gender inequity in general. And so that definitely fueled my belief that whether it's your gender, whether it's your race, whatever is most core to your identity, it's incredibly empowering to know your history. And we are taught a very singular history often in most K through 12 education system. And so that was definitely kind of awakening I took with me to founding Curious Cardinals, was like, I want every student to be able to learn their past, learn from someone they can see themselves in, because that there's nothing more empowering than that, especially when your identity might be part of what marginalizes you in some way or makes you feel isolated or less included in some way.
Yeah, and you said I think sometimes we also learn things about our history that we're not so proud of or that we don't, and I'll even speak to sort of and this is in a similar way. I actually completely changed my course because of a class, and this was my freshman year. I got placed into a class because the other ones were full. It was like, oh, gosh, why am I taking this class?
No
And
way.
it was called, but that happens all the time, right? And but the course was called Environmental Ethics and Religion. And so the perspective was learning multiple level or, multiple aspects of religion from Catholicism to Buddhism and how that plays into our role in environmental sustainability, but also our role in child rearing, which was
Mm.
so interesting to me. And that's where I'm like, oh my gosh, young girls and young boys are taught. I grew up Catholic. So for me, I was reading the Bible and interpreting it in a very different way, thinking Adam, and Eve, the differences between how girls and boys are perceived in these stories. It's like, I mean, it was all these things that nobody had really sat me down and talked about. I was writing papers on my history and my religious background, and it was as that professor ended up becoming my advisor for my study abroad research at the end of the day.
You go
Yeah,
study abroad.
I did. And I actually did a summer program. This is something students don't know, also, by the way. I had a very packed schedule because I changed my major 3 times. So some students think, oh my gosh, if you can change your major, guys, it's okay. It happens all the time. But I changed my major 3 times. And as a result, my teachers were telling me I couldn't study abroad. I didn't have time. So I actually did it over the summer. I applied for a summer grant that paid me essentially to go do research in Costa Rica. And I did, and I actually did my research on child rearing, on how little young boys and young girls are being taught certain things in very rural Latin communities.
Wow, what a cool research to conduct. But you're emphasizing so many things, the classes you weren't meant to be in, they might be the classes that open up so many doors. The fact that you might not realize what you want to study and something totally transforms everything for you. Even as you said, hearing a different perspective than what you grew up with, even hearing perspectives that might make you feel a bit uncomfortable can be so enlightening and open your world to so many more things. And that's hopefully what the beauty of college is too, is entering this ecosystem that brings so many people from so many different walks of lives and just kind of opens your world to so many different opportunities and pathways.
Exactly. And curiosity. So this brings me back to you because I think, it opened up my sort of vision, my tunnel vision, I like to say, to way more possibilities and curiosities that I just wanted to learn more about. Social justice, identity, dialogue, social psychology. And so speaking of passion projects, now I sort of want to bring it back because I want to say this is truly what Curious Cardinals is. So can you share a little bit more about Curious Cardinals? Because I want to get into how that plays into the college experience too. I think there's a really strong tie there.
Totally. So at Curious Cardinals, at the core of what we do, we connect K through 12 students to college mentors, near peer college mentors, to help them discover and pursue their passions. And so first I'll share kind of the 4 pillars that distinguish us and are core to our philosophy, and then I'll explain the tracks and what actually working with Curious Cardinals looks like. There's 4 core pillars: 1, near peer mentorship; 2, passion-based learning; 3, project-based learning; and 4, representation matters. Near peer mentorship, learning from a college student who's not too much further in age than yourself, so they can set out the path to where they got to and make it feel attainable. Our mentors were in our students' shoes not too long ago. They also grew up on social media. They also had their education halted by the pandemic. They get it. So the relatability factor is huge, and instilling that sense of belief in a student. You were talking about research. I published some research in the Stanford Historical Journal, and one of the first students I worked with was like, oh my God, Audrey, how did you write this? And I said to her, you are so much further ahead of where I was when I was your age. Imagine where you're going to be when you're my age. Mm-hmm. And she had this like light bulb explosion, like, you're right. And so the mentors can set out that path. The second pillar is passion-based learning. Unfortunately, we teach in silos. but we live in a hyper interconnected world. And so if a student comes in and is passionate about sports, they can learn sports analytics or sports journalism, or maybe they love cosmetics, they can learn cosmetic chemistry. And we really try to, a lot of our students at College Match, it's awesome, came in passionate about mental health, and they're doing research on like mental health and psychology, or starting a blog. So there's so many cool ways that you can think about what are the things you're genuinely curious about or interested in, and tie those to different applications of pursuing a project or making an impact in the world. And so it's also about anchoring learning in the why. We want students to be able to have those authentic discussions with their mentors as to, why am I reading Shakespeare? Or why am I learning geometry? And this is someone who, it's a vulnerable, authentic space for you to kind of lean into that passion and lean into that curiosity. The third pillar is project-based learning. The majority, though not all, of our engagements culminate in project deliverables. More than anything about the project-based learning is about the ethos of project-based learning, where I didn't take computer science in high school, Andrea, not because I wasn't interested, but because I thought maybe I'll get a bad grade and it'll tarnish my chances of getting into Stanford, which is such a terrible reason not to try something, but it's real. So often that fear of failure inhibits students from even trying. So we aim to detach that fear of failure and encourage exploration. And then the fourth pillar is representation matters. You are what you can see. I was one of the few girls in my honors math class. I lacked a lot of confidence in STEM. It was sophomore and junior year. I failed the test. I was crying. I think I heard after the fact that a ton of other kids do, but as I said, I was the only girl, maybe the most expressive. No one else seemed like they got a bad grade. And instead of saying to me, Audrey, you belong in this space, you can be here, someone was like, yeah, maybe you want to go to regular math. And I just didn't see myself in that space. I probably prematurely deemed myself a humanities girl. I was like, I'm just not cut out for this. This is not for me. And so whether it's your gender, whether it's your race, whether it's your socioeconomic background, whether it's a learning difference you have, whether it's an aspiration to be a college athlete, whatever it is that's most core to your identity, we want to match students to a mentor who they can see themselves in. So that never gets in the way of their aspirations. And so at Curious Cardinals, we have kind of, as most of your students are pursuing the passion project, but especially some of our younger students we work with, there's kind of 3 tracks, which is exploration and the exploratory journey, which we were talking about earlier, which is for a student who doesn't know where they want to start or has no idea what they're interested in, kind of embarking on this guided exploration with a mentor. The second is the passion project, which is if you have a dream project in mind, or you have something you're passionate about, but you're like, what can I do with this? How can I apply this in a way and have a tangible impact in the world? You can work with a mentor through that passion project journey and really work backwards as to, where do I want to be 6 weeks from now? And then what are the steps I'm going to take week by week to actually get there and bring that project to fruition? And even thereafter, after launching that MVP with the mentor, like, where am I going to take this next? How am I going to make an impact beyond? And so that's the passion project. And that's really personalized. Students, it's all about kind of honing in on the thing they're interested in and the application in the world that they want to bring to life. And then the third track, we do some academic mentorship, which is kind of general mentorship and skills or topics. But it's all about really meeting students where they're at in their journey. And I think what we'll really hone in on is that passion project, because it is a culmination of, for some students, what they've been kind of figuring out about themselves for the years prior, and kind of how they're bringing that passion to life in the real world in some way.
Yeah, and you mentioned a couple of things that I sort of want to unpack, and one of them is this idea that there's an exploration phase where if you are just completely unsure, I hear this from students where I think when you're making an activities list, and let's really quickly go there, and when you're applying to college, you've got to list out all of the things that you spent time on, and I think students technically think academics right away. For them, it's like, what have I done in the classroom and at school? And they forget that they also have family responsibilities at home, and that they also crochet on their, downtime, or they paint and they have artistic skills, or, there are all these, again, curiosities that they have. I had one student who had completely disassembled his computer because it wasn't working, and figured out how to fix it again. And that ended up becoming his personal statement. And I had one student who wrote his personal statement. He used to go pick up scrap metal with his dad, and he found an old bike one day and ended up rebuilding that bike from scratch, and repainting it from year to year to like match his different styles. That turned into his personal statement, and it's like, you don't think that these little things that you're doing on a regular, sometimes they think it's their normal, which it is, but it's not meaningful enough to address in a college application. And so I love that Curious Cardinal says, yes, it is meaningful. It belongs in your story, and let's explore it more, like that crocheting can be a business, or it can be, something creative.
I mean, we had a student who created an Instagram account with like 10,000 followers. And when we were asking them all their interests, that was like the last thing that came up. And we were like, that is so impressive. You have marketing skills, you have an entrepreneurial spirit, whatever you've been putting out in the world, like people want to see, you have a skill set there. But there's certain kind of focus areas or things students spend their time on, whether it's family responsibilities or running a social media account, which maybe academia and what they think is right or wrong doesn't deem as valuable or worthwhile. And so I'm so with you on how can we shape that narrative, and also tell students that the thing they're authentically interested in, they're probably going to accomplish the most extraordinary outcome with. And so really validate that and encourage them to run with it. Because I think that's another misconception of like, that's not going to look good for college, or no one cares about that, when oftentimes that's going to be the most unique thing that anyone has seen on an activity sheet.
Yeah, thank you. And you said it, the big word is unique. And I think especially now, right, students are trying to find ways in their application. And let us sort of give you this advice now, right? It's about finding ways to make you stand out and be unique. Programs like Curious Cardinals allow you the opportunity to explore something that nobody else can testify to. So, for example, this is my passion project, was creating a podcast in light of highlighting my peers' stories, my peers being admissions officers and admissions personnel and higher ed folks. And, this is unique experience that I uncovered, but it's something that drives my personal passions. And actually, I let me kick it to you, Audrey. Do you have any other success stories of students who have just thought so uniquely about this project that it's turned into, I think, just something that nobody else could have created?
So, there's
Probably so many.
Yeah, it's so exciting to see too where students have taken their initiatives. I'll name a few, but every year I'm surprised by like what someone has come up with or how they put together a project in a certain way. Last week I just spoke with a student who he wasn't that engaged in school and didn't have that many interests and didn't really find the meaning in school. But he listened to some podcasts, or maybe he saw something on his TikTok about entrepreneurs, and he thought, oh, it'd be cool to create something. And he lives in Colorado and was interested in kind of mountain ranges, and realized, I don't even know how he got here, but he wanted to create something with his passion for kind of the great outdoors and entrepreneurship. And so he figured out online, he wanted to make candles that kind of emulated the mountain geography. So peculiar, but he didn't know where to start. He was like, where do I get the money? Where do I create this? How do I map this out? Like, where do I even begin? And then he was presented with the opportunity to apply to be part of Curious Cardinals, and he got matched to an entrepreneurship mentor. And suddenly this kind of dream idea, which felt a little bit like a fantasy, and like no one was assigning it to him. I think that's something also crazy that students go through, is this experience of you assigning something to yourself. A teacher's not telling you to do it. You don't have a deadline. It's your own initiative, and you have accountability, which is both the most empowering, enlightening thing, but also can be kind of scary and sometimes even intimidate a student from starting. But he worked with this mentor. He learned about entrepreneurship. He learned how to make a business plan. He figured out how to do it. And he was able to, he has a website now, and he's selling this specially manufactured candle, and he's going in town on weekends to advertise it to people. And he's just totally run with it. And now he's going to college and he's still working on it. And he just wrote our team for advice on how to market it. And it's just, I think for him, he said it's transformed his life because he wasn't that engaged in the classroom, but he found something that really engaged him and felt tangible. And so that was really awesome to see, and see kind of how he can apply that to other facets of his life and the choices he determines he'll make. We had another student who loved video games, and his dad was like, anything but video games, please. We said, what if you could learn how to code your own video game? Like, that would be pretty cool. And so he learned how to code his own video game. He learned how to design it. He then himself too, once kind of that flame went off, he was his own autodidact. He kind of had the confidence and excitement to like browse through YouTube videos, and he had that foundation he could build upon himself. And he launched this video game. He spent ultimately, after kind of that first exploration with Curious Cardinals, then doing a passion project, he spent 1.5 years working on this, and he would spend countless hours after school, on weekends. It was really independently driven, but fueled by a mentor who said, I believe in you, you can do this. And kind of, again, that like spark. And he's going to school next year, and his goal is to study engineering so he could be a video game designer. He has built a game that is phenomenal. It is so impressive. I think more impressive than what peers of mine who are software engineers at Stanford could build. But really what's most phenomenal is the transformation we've seen in him. He went from this student who was like, I don't know what I'm interested in, and kind of shrugging sheepishly, to like, I have such enormous conviction in what I want to do. He was like, I don't care where I go to college. I just want to study engineering now because I know what I want to do in the world. And just to see that, like a student really develop that, is the thing we strive for. And I think it's that combination of exposure and then pursuit that really instills that sense of confidence in an individual.
I agree. I think that these seeds are planted there. Now it just takes our network, the mentors in our life, to nurture them a little bit, to add a little bit of water here and there. And once those grow, it just, again, it flourishes into these passions. And one thing that I want students to know, if you are listening to this podcast today and you might be a first generation student, or you're the first in your family, and you might think, oh my gosh, but how am I going to get money to make candles, and how am I going to get money to do video games and stuff? Well, listen, one big skill that we all have to, and I had to learn this, is asking for help. And I mentioned earlier having to study abroad, and I told, so many people told me I couldn't do it, and I knew I wanted to do it. So I applied for a grant that helped pay for that experience, but there was still a gap, and I still had to ask my family members. Back then I had to like cold call them and write letters. There wasn't anything like a GoFundMe or anything of that sort. And in that case, family, people in your life, mentors, your network will support your passions if you express them. Nobody's going to know what you have going on unless you say it, right? It's so similar to your college applications. Those admissions officers aren't going to know what's going on in your life, what you're doing, and how stellar you are unless you tell them, right?
100%. And I think you captured it perfectly, which is, I'm telling these stories and the outcomes, but the students didn't have it all sorted out, both fiscally and very in a literal sense from the beginning. And so that's our approach, is we're going to give someone who believes in you and is going to ask you, how can I help you? What support do you need? But the hope is kind of, especially after that first 6 sessions, is you have a bit more of that confidence to ask for yourself, to say like, hey, I want to take this to the next level. What can I do? Do you have any advice or guidance? I want to invest in this, but I don't have the money. Can you lend me some? And this is my plan to be able to pay you back. Like that's, I think, and it often takes feeling that someone believes in you. And I hope anyone listening to this today just feels our energy, that we believe in you and ask for that help. But all of these students, so much of their learning journey wasn't just what they accomplished, but was also kind of that confidence and emotional independence and self-awareness that developed as well as a result of seeing that no one can do anything alone. It always requires asking for help in some way. And if you find the right person or you do the outreach, as long as you're respectful, as long as you send a thank you follow-up, you can even, something I always tell students is send that follow-up. These people are busy. Maybe they didn't see your email. Don't take it personally. Respond. I respectfully wanted to follow up. As long as you say a thank you, like, people want to help and people want to be there for you and nurture your passions and interests and open doors for you. And so that's something else that it's not written in the Curious Cardinals curriculum, but we really aim to instill in our students that you have to advocate for yourself or no one else will. And I think how can we help you? It can feel uncomfortable. Even I think as adults, I still sometimes practice. The worst thing that can happen is they say no. The best thing that can happen is they say yes. And so it's a continual practice. And I think that the passion project is a really beautiful place to start, of just have an idea and put yourself out there in the world. Cold email the professor, cold email the local shop owner, like whoever it is, wherever it is. Experience putting yourself out there in the world, because it's terrifying. But once you get that one positive response, it can give you the confidence to keep going.
Absolutely. And a part of life, even as an adult, you said it, Audrey, is we are going to hear no's in our life. This is, if we're even talking about college applications, I would be lying, tell my students, I would be lying to you if I said that you aren't going to get rejected somewhere, whether it's now or whether it's in your career, your professional experience, in a job, right? Those no's will eventually lead to a yes, but don't let anybody else don't let you tell yourself no, right? Let them tell you no and then move on from it, right? And I believe that students hold themselves back so much because I can't afford it, or how am I going to do that? Curious Cardinals, for example, you are so gracious in the sense that you even offer scholarships for students to, support these passion projects, and I think there are so many organizations like yours out there who are saying, like, everybody counts in this, right? It's not just maybe affluent people or people who come from means. We want everybody to have access, which is partly why I started this podcast. And I sort of mentioned earlier, if this is your first time tuning in, my biggest mission for this podcast was to provide access to students who may not otherwise have these resources, but also to remind students of all different walks of life that your journey might be a little bit tilted. There might be some changes and bumps and barriers along the way. Like you mentioned earlier, Audrey, right? You had a COVID-19 halt that has led you to your dream job, but at the same time, Stanford is still awaits, right? There's this long gap period you have, and that 100% happens. There are other reasons why people have to take educational gaps. Maybe it's financial aid. Maybe they have a baby, right? I used to work at an all-girls school that, worked with a lot of young teen moms who had a different type of track, and it was still education in some way, and so that was, again, part of why this seed was planted, because I wanted folks of all walks of life, young adults to youth, to even adults my age, in their late 40s, even, right? Even beyond my age, to know that you can still do this, right? There are opportunities out there.
100%. And I think especially when you're in high school and you experience that failure for the first time, or that obstacle, it feels irreversible. It feels devastating and terrifying. And I think when I look back on high school, it was those times I lost, those times I failed, that I grew the most. And that I have the most impactful stories about who I am as a person, how Audrey ultimately was resilient and came out of XYZ scenario. I often talk, people say, what set you up to be an entrepreneur? You weren't studying entrepreneurship. You didn't have a plan to do this. And in high school, and I was a very serious track runner. I initially was going to run track in college, actually. And in middle school, in like 7th grade or 6th grade, I was like the #1 track mile runner in New York City. And then I got injured, and then I went through puberty and my body changed. And I didn't beat that 7th grade time till 10th or 11th grade. And I had all my bets on, this is how I'm going to get into college. This is who I am as a person. And it was It was demoralizing, but I kept showing up. I kept going to practice. I kept saying, I'm going to get there. It's going to happen. And then I finally beat that time. I finally persevered. Junior year, beat the school records. And that might sound so silly and trivial, but whether it's from a track team or a sports team you're on or the club you're in school, when you're losing, it's just about showing up again, coming back to practice, trying again the next day. And it can feel so challenging in the moment to have that motivation and belief in yourself to show up again. But I think ultimately that consistency of just, I'm going to keep trying, I'm going to keep putting in the work, as well as the resilience you build where, yeah, it doesn't feel great for 3+ years to feel like I'm not beating my time. Like I'm growing up, I'm getting smarter, but I'm slower than my 7th grade self. But it teaches you so much about kind of mentally and internally how you can grow, even if results aren't showing or you're not getting the victory. And I just think if anyone can take anything away of just put yourself out there and embrace failure, embrace loss, and know that that's just going to make for the more dimensional human you'll become and story you'll have to share, that would be extraordinary.
Yeah, thank you for that. Right. The hardest part is always showing up, I definitely say. And one thing you also just reminded me of is, we were sort of talking about different trajectories and paths. And I've mentioned this in my previous podcast is nobody ever wants to see you fail. Your professors truly are there to uplift you and uplift whatever path that is, even if it doesn't seem like it at the time. So when you went back to Stanford and said, I'm actually not coming back, actually, I'm going to start my business because this has literally lifted my soul, right? This has brought me so much joy. What was the response from the people around you, and how, because I think about that all the time. I think, oh my gosh, I hear it so much from my students. Sometimes they won't even tell me what's going on because they're afraid I will be disappointed, or they're afraid that I, will have the different reaction. And that could never be the case with, mentors in your life. At least that's how I feel. Right. And if they are disappointed, they are not your mentors and they are not people on your side. At least that's what I believe. So can you share a little bit about that experience and any advice you have for folks who might be in that situation?
Well, I'll say my mother was really uncomfortable. I was at Stanford, which is kind of it's the most amazing place with so many opportunities. And it was definitely a risk pausing my studies to pursue this. There was a mentor I met freshman year, actually, and I knew it came from a place of love. It was just, this is the track that so many kids have gone down and it works and they're happy. And I don't know anyone who's gone down this path. So he was a little nervous for me. And it was definitely, I think, especially because when I first met him, I thought I was going to be a lawyer and I had a 10-year life plan. So the fact that I had changed course, I thought I was disappointing him. And even though he didn't really fully support the decision and thought that kind of the track most trodden was the one to take, I knew that ultimately he believed in me. And I needed to kind of distinguish someone to care for you can manifest differently than their advice for you. And it's often just out of fear and wanting what's best for you, but you need to listen to your gut. Someone said to me once, listen to your whispers. If you don't, they'll become screams. And so I think really just kind of, it's so hard as to do that, to say, I'm going to do something that a parent doesn't approve of, or this husband doesn't approve of, but if it needs to also be logical and there needs to be some security as well. It's not just making crazy, reckless decisions, but there was a lot of thoughtfulness that went into it. I think the greatest thing was that it was a risk. And what I was able to determine, I'm really fortunate, Stanford says that if you leave school, as long as you tell them where you went and why you want to return, you can come back. And so I said, the greatest risk, if this doesn't work and I can't support myself, or Curious Cardinals does not work out financially, or in terms of the impact we want to have, whatever worst case scenario that could have very well have happened, I am fortunate that I can return to school. And so I think that was kind of with any decision, it's weighing the outcomes and also listening to your instinct and kind of making that decision accordingly.
Yeah, yeah. And I wholeheartedly believe that your journey is going to find its place. And sometimes it takes a very, very long time, and I think about some of the students I used to teach at my old high school, right? I said they came from very different walks of life. A lot of them were teen moms, had been on probation and juvenile hall. So, talk about a trajectory being uplifted, right? For unknown circumstances and traumatic experiences. Um, but with all that to say, I think some of them, in all of the light, still found some joy and energy in education, right? Whether it was getting that degree, which some of them did, right there, that's so awesome for them. Others started at school, went to a college, but then found a different passion, right? I think it's just, again, knowing that your journey is going to be whatever you make it, but not giving up on whatever that is. And I think there are way too many let's talk. I think there's just way too many distractions now, people that are saying you can't. I mean, you and I, Audrey, have talked a lot about like this affirmative action case in our down, outside of this
Yeah,
podcast. And I think
yeah,
that's just one example of perhaps students who are first generation or BIPOC or LGBTQ and plus, I mean, all these different identities feeling like, okay, somebody's telling me I can't. And so I loved that quote you said is, like listen to the whispers because eventually they could turn into a scream and, listen to that gut for sure. But know
totally.
that, at the same time, I think, education is important. I do truly believe that in some capacity, right, your education matters. So at least try it,
100%. And I
explore.
think for me, I mean, in making that decision, what I realized was that in founding Curious Cardinals, I was learning and growing so much, and I didn't want to compromise that learning and growth. And so I think it's often that's part of what makes me so fortunate in this role is that I am continually learning and growing. And there's no place where there's still outcomes though that we this is a job and a livelihood, and we need
Yes.
to be able to provide for ourselves. We have families and parents who work at Curious Cardinals, and so there's higher stakes. The beauty of school is the learning and growth with minimal stakes. You really get to put yourself out there, and yes, if you try your best and show up with your best, putting your best foot forward, that is just such a beautiful sacred experience that no one can take lightly. And so I could not agree with you more there. And I think too, when you're talking about society and so many people telling you you can't or you don't fit in or you don't belong, one thing that I feel I've become all the more embracing of recently is positive self-talk. I
Mm.
think that if you're able to realize I have negative voices in my head, maybe it's fear, I'm so nervous, I can't do this, or whether it's this doesn't feel good, or what if I don't get it, or what if I fail, or what if I don't get in? If you're able to start to realize, like, hey, what's fear doing in there? Someone once told me, and I think I still need to do it, like, get a little action figure, put it on your desk, and name it fear. So when you
Mm.
feel it, you're like, not that scary. This is fear. I can look at it and it's kind of small, and it's actually I can overcome fear. I can look it in the face. And so
Mm.
that's another piece of advice to share is if you can realize that so much of it is about the mentality of whether you believe in yourself or not. And when you hear those voices creeping in your head, whether it's fear or lack of belief in yourself or anxiety, whatever it is, and you can say, cup half full. What do I have agency over? There's so much to be positive about. What can I believe in? And just get those voices out. That's half the battle.
Yeah. And it's like normalizing your experience too, I think, and realizing, that you're not alone, right? What you might be going through is what a lot of people go through. Therapy, all of these things really help. I think it's very stigmatized nowadays, but you mentioned something earlier on in the podcast is also knowing your history, which was your sort of intention, right? Like you coming back to like immigration and having that as sort of a route to what you did. And that is so important. And it's not just, hey, where did my parents come from? But it's like, where did my ancestors come from and what were their struggles to get me to where I am today? Right. The deeply rooted situations and scenarios that I think can sort of help uplift you to know, oh my gosh, like way back then, what they were going through doesn't compare, but at the same time, how can I live those shared experiences for them,
Totally, 100%. And just know kind of what that says about who you are and like the superpowers you've gotten passed down to you from their own experiences and their journeys, and how everyone has their own story. And whether that kind of both gives you confidence in yourself, but also helps build compassion and empathy for others. It's a really beautiful kind of way to view the world, is everyone has their own story and everyone has their own history. And there's so much more than what you see at the surface level.
Yes, 100%. And so before I round out our podcast, I just want to ask you, because this podcast really is also all about advice. It's about encouraging and inspiring, and showing students, parents, everybody out there that you have people in these spaces that care about you, right? That success matters. But additionally, it is about advice sharing. And so earlier I said, right, one thing to elevate your application is to take these types of activities like Curious Cardinals, and think about, okay, how is Curious Cardinals, for example, teaching me a plethora of skills? So one thing I tell my students, your one activity with Curious Cardinals goes into 3 different slots on their applications. One, it'll go into an essay. 2, it'll go into sort of the extra, what is the overall extracurricular that you're doing, which is called Curious Cardinals. This is the program and its mission. But then underneath that, what is your role? And I'm thinking of a student that I helped last year who was in your program, and she coded her own Egyptian hieroglyphics. And I'm like, you are a coder. Like, you now have a title as a coder, so your one activity and being part of Curious Cardinals has now turned into 3 aspects on your application.
Totally. And
Yeah.
I think that's where like what you can start to do when you're on the younger side is just think, you don't have to have it all figured out, but maybe 2 things. Maybe say, I like building, and building can lead to coding. Maybe you say, I'm passionate about the environment, and you're listen to podcasts and you read a book, and then by junior summer you do your Curious Cardinals passion project. There's so many other ways kind of you can build up to this and create this narrative and figure out what will be the kind of culmination of those learnings. And it speaks to so many parts of your identity because it's something you're uniquely seeking out. As I said, it's not something a teacher's assigning of you. It doesn't have a specific due date. It's really about the work you put in and the fact that you're showing up and what you accomplish when you do just that.
Yes, definitely, definitely. And I do have a question from an audience member, actually. And so the first question is, what are some pitfalls that can be avoided when pursuing a passion project? That's a good question. There's obviously not everything comes in a straight line. So
Totally. I would say doing the work up front of where you want to be at the end. And that might be like with our students this summer who are doing the 6-session passion project, there's kind of 2 stages. There's like, where do I want to be on August 20th when I'm going to be presenting at the Curious Cardinal Summer Symposium? And where do I want to be 1 year from now when I've run with this project even further and kind of it's taken a life of its own beyond what I've accomplished with the mentor, and work backwards. What I see things go kind of off track and not in a great direction is when it's a little directionless and aimless. And that's not to say that it's going to turn out exactly as you thought it would. It might actually take twists and turns and be totally nonlinear. But if you have a clear sense of, what am I accomplishing? Am I trying to develop new skills? Do I want to write a research paper that's going to be really insightful or really impressive, and I want to be able to share with people to change their perspective? Like, what are you trying to accomplish? And write that down, have a conversation with your mentor, put it in paper, and then use that as your North Star. Kind of each session, are we working towards that? Are we on track to get there? So that is like the main thing I would say, is have some sort of direction of where you're trying to go. And it might change course along the way, and that's amazing and beautiful, but as long as you start with some clarity, it'll guide your journey accordingly.
Yeah, I love that you said also, is like, embrace the change a little bit, because it will very likely happen, and the pitfalls will also come for sure.
Totally.
And then another question is, if you were a young kid, because we did talk a little bit about maybe like high school age students, but if I'm younger than that and I don't even know where to start, what advice would you give a kid that's unsure about their passions?
Exposure, 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 and make it fun. Maybe you love movies. Okay, well, we don't have to just watch the maybe rom-com movies. Maybe you're going to start watching documentaries and you're going to say, once a week, I'm going to find YouTubes and try something different. Maybe you love podcasts. Maybe you like reading. Like, figure out the medium that sings to you. For example, for me, someone recommended a podcast for me 10th grade. This is when I had joined the debate team and I was becoming more passionate about social justice. And it was a podcast called NPR's More Perfect. And it's all about specific Supreme Court cases. It goes into their history and the stories behind it. I highly recommend it. And I would listen to an episode once a week and I would totally nerd out. I was so into it that I would do research after. And it literally was what made me be like, I want to do law. This is so, so cool. This is so impactful. This is so fascinating. And so don't overcomplicate it. That's the other thing we were saying. Just to learn something, it doesn't mean you have to take a class in school with a textbook. There's so many diverse medium out there, whether it's social media or podcasts or YouTube or articles online where you can learn so much. And so just expose yourself to different things. And I will say that some things take time. So before you say like, oh, I listened to one episode or I read one thing about the environment, I'm not so interested in it. Try like at least 2, at least 3, so you just get a bit of depth, and then that third time you can be like, okay, this is not for me. But the exposure, and then don't overcomplicate it, I think, and then just dive in. I think that's the most amazing thing about living in this generation. Even coming across your podcast, for example, there's so many nuggets you can find, and so don't underestimate that. Don't just think because it's not in a textbook or it's not taught in a classroom or it doesn't have a grade at the end that it doesn't matter, because it's incredibly valuable and it could be the beginning of your own impactful passion journey.
Yeah, yeah. And you just reminded me also about, again, it's like bringing it back because I'm thinking college applications too. And there are certain colleges that will ask you, I'm thinking Columbia is a good example. In the last few years, one of their questions is, what are some articles, newspapers, magazines, things that keep you busy outside of the classroom? They don't want to know about the textbooks that you're reading or the required, of Mice and Men Stein books, but Steinbeck books that you're reading. They want to know what you are engaging in to make sure you're alert, you're aware. And this can be anything like TikTok, people or influencers, all the way to, like you said, podcasts that keep you engaged and entertained. I had one student who also mentioned some of the she was a huge advocate and protester, so she started reading some Angela Davis books because she just felt so empowered. So again, these colleges want to know. And then Stanford is a good example. You and I were talking about this earlier. They asked a question: how did you spend your summer, your last 2 summers? That's one of their essay questions. And again, as long as you can say more than I watched Netflix and series all day, as long as you can testify to the fact that you kept yourself busy in meaningful ways. It's not, oh, I was part of the same club or I did a volunteer at the beach thing, right? It's about finding meaning in this.
Totally. And I think, again, I think that's another like valuable thing is push yourself to gain some kind of digital native skills and understanding and comfort, because let's say you find the podcast you love, you can't stop listening to it. Maybe like me, I was like, I want all my friends to listen. None of my friends would listen. I could have started a Substack. I don't even need to know how to code to make a website now. I can go on Substack. I can say, I'm going to listen to this podcast that I totally nerd out over. And then I'm going to write what I learned and why I want my friends to listen to it too, or why I think it matters. And there's my blog. Suddenly I'm creating something. Suddenly I'm not just this passive consumer, but I'm an active creator, sharing my takeaways and learnings with the world. No teacher is going to judge what I wrote on my Substack. No one's going to evaluate it or give it any criticism. But I think that's kind of that next phase. It's once you've kind of absorbed and gained that exposure, once you have something that sparks your interest, think, how can I not just be a passive consumer, but a creator in some way? And it doesn't have to cost money. It doesn't have to require many to no resources at all. Don't overcomplicate it, but just think, even lean into what's most authentic, like the fact that you wanted to tell your friend about what you just learned or listened to or watched, and like put that into writing and share it with the world publicly. So I think that's another thing, is like, just don't overcomplicate it, but go through that cycle of exposure, absorbing, to engaging, to not just engaging passively, but doing something active. And that, those are like 3 different things on your activity sheet, if we're going to bring it back to that.
Yes, it's excellent. And very, very good advice. And for folks who don't know what Substacker is, so you said it, Substacker?
Yeah, Substack.
It's essentially a blogger, right? A blog platform.
And you literally, it makes it so easy. I would never have been able to make my own blog, code my own website, and maybe we can put it in the lesson notes or the episode notes. But you can just create your own account. It doesn't cost money. You, if anything, you can monetize it once you get an audience. You can have people pay to subscribe. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's first get some good content out there. But what I'm just saying is there's so many free tools out there that can empower students to be creators in so many meaningful ways.
Fabulous. And we will drop some of those resources in the description. Absolutely. Once, when you're tuning in, you can read that description at any point and gain access to all sorts of resources. And Audrey, I cannot thank you enough for your time. Again, the beauty of Inspired Conversations is this is sort of twofold. I do these interviews live so that students, parents, allies, counselors can jump in, tune in, and ask questions, as we saw today. But they're also recorded and they will be posted on all platforms later. So this episode in particular, in a couple of weeks, will be accessible to all, because it is all about access and, sharing knowledge. It's not about gatekeeping any of this. We want you to thrive. We want you to succeed. So if you have any questions, I'll also drop in Audrey's information. Before we leave today, though, Audrey, are there any last pieces of advice? You gave so much today. I feel like this is just jam-packed, right, with positivity. But anything last that you would like to share with our audience?
I'll just say kind of like 3 pieces of advice that I had thought about before we spoke. For anyone listening, I would say 1, seek out mentors and resources early, whether you're part of an organization like College Match that connects you with Curious Cardinals, or you hear about us and you want to connect. As I said, don't let a price tag on our website hold you back. Advocate, reach out. But beyond that, when you're in college, go to first-gen offices, multicultural centers, academic advisors, professors, all of these various resources that exist that can provide invaluable support. And do your best to not be afraid to ask questions and lean on those who've navigated this path before. You deserve to have people in your corner. So whether it's through the people in a university or a school, or even on the internet, as we keep talking about, there's so many ways you can reach out to people, but don't underestimate the value of having that mentorship and support, and find the person. And as long as you're grateful for their time and say thank you and are respectful, I'm sure they're going to want to create the time and make the space to be there for you. The second is be your own advocate. We talked about this too, but really speak up when you need help academically or personally. Self-advocacy is a skill that will serve you long-term, and don't underestimate the power in your voice and story. And then the final thing, which feels very Curious Cardinals, is remember your why. I think when challenges arise, if you can stay grounded in what motivated you to pursue higher ed in the first place, your goals are valid and the journey is rewarding even during the difficult times. So stay encouraged and know you have so much to offer, and your presence and perspective matters.
Thank you so much for all of that. And that is a beautiful way to end today's podcast. Remember, your story matters. And this is a series that's going to go into the summer until the end of September, because I know this is when, we're thinking applications, we're thinking college. If you're thinking about going back, all these things come to mind. Again, these episodes will also be shared widely on all podcast platforms. So if you're not able to tune in on Tuesdays live, know that all of your voice, Audrey, will be heard, as well as all of our other guests. So thank you so much for your time today, and we'll see you all next time.
Thank you. Thank you. Good luck, everyone.
Thank you for tuning in to this Inspired Conversation, where I interviewed a change maker in higher education. If you enjoyed today's episode, please like, subscribe, and rate the podcast. If you do, you'll get an update once a new powerful story is posted. And more importantly, you'll help spread the word about some of the advice and tips we've given to students. For a list of resources shared in today's episode, read the description attached. One of my favorite things about this interactive podcast is that it's recorded live. So if you have questions for our guest presenters, you can tune in as well. For a list of upcoming live podcasts, follow Inspired Conversations Pod on Instagram and click the link in my bio. If you are tuning in today and have questions about college applications, college success, or financial aid, email me at counselorcova@gmail.com. Again, that's counselorcova@gmail.com. Know that you're not alone. I've been a college access and success counselor for many years, and I got your back. Remember, your success is your community's success, and you got this. I'll see you next time.